particularly radical. At the same time as thinking about nature and the imagination, about the Lake District, about the sea, about the river, about the waterfall, there is also an attention in Romanticism to the emotional province of the Gothic novel. So it's no surprise that many of the greatest Gothic novels, C.M. Attray's Melmoth the Wanderer, James Hogg's Private Memoirs, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, M.G. Lewis's The Monk, Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, are all Romantic era epochs. So there is a preoccupation with gloomy introspection, abnormal mental states, madness, drug addiction, horror, the supernatural, the Gothic. So Byron's poetry, Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which is a diary of his drug taking. De Quincey used to drink laudanum, which is a kind of form of liquid opium in great quantities. And that book is a visionary diary of his hallucinations while under the influence of opium. And the Gothic fictions of Anne Radcliffe, The Mysteries of Udolpho, Lewis's The Monk, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and John Polidori's The Vampire of 1819. So vampires finally get mentioned in a kind of conference on The Vampire Strikes Back. And that's the only thing I've got to say about vampires myself. So Radcliffe is most well known for these two fictions, Udolpho and The Italian. And they use the expliqué method. That word should have an acute accent on, but my keyboard forbade it. So this is an example of a novel of terror. So when Radcliffe's heroines are threatened by marauding, often male, sinister forces who threaten their freedom and their virtue, in the end, when the heroine thinks she has seen, say, a ghost or a fiend from hell, in the end, that is explained away. So it wasn't a ghost, it was a man with a white sheet on his head, as in the average episode of Scooby-Doo. So it's explained away. And the idea being that, yes, in the Gothic novel we look at our deepest fantasies, we look evil in the face, but in the end, our fears are rationalized and explained away. So it's a rationalization of the Gothic. But however, in the so-called novel of horror, the diablerie, the grotesquerie, the hellish, the ghoulish, the monstrous is real. And that is the 1790s form of M.G. Lewis, Matthew Gregory Lewis, 1775 to 1818, a fabulously wealthy homosexual, same as Walpole. There's a very strong kind of gay influence on early Gothic, and antiquarian and member of Parliament and Gothic novelist. So his story, his most famous story is The Monk, which is the tale of a noble-minded, pure, virtuous monk who suddenly gets taken up by thoughts of lust and sexuality, and in the end is imprisoned in the Inquisition, the cells of the Inquisition, but sells his soul to the devil to escape, and ends up being killed by the devil in the infamous final scene of the book. You see illustrated there. So the devil, Satan, is real in this book in a way that he's not in the terror fiction of Anne Radcliffe. So you have the emphasis on terror in the works of Mrs. Radcliffe, and on horror in the lurid stories of the monk. So the monk is the most violent and sexually explicit of early British Gothic novels. Its themes of lust, homosexuality, incestuous rape, matricides, leads with the devil. And Alison mentioned that revolting scene where the nun, who driven insane by the death of her baby, wanders through her subterranean cell with kind of horrid worms coming out of the putrefied baby's eyes, and it's all rather strong stuff, shall we say. So it's set in a convent and attacks the repressiveness of the Catholic Church. It's another example of the Gothic novels working with a kind of certain anti-Catholic discourse. So there are scenes of violence and destruction in the death and mutilation of a cruel abbess. Okay, so let's take the story across to France. And you see why in a moment. Gothic novels are hugely popular in France. There is a French intellectual tradition of admiration for English Gothic, among such famous and notable French writers as Baudelaire, Balzac, Rimbaud. But the first of the genre's admirers is the most notorious. This is the infamous Marquis de Sade of 1740 to 1814, a novelist and pornographer and political prisoner in the time of the French Revolution. And he was very taken with Gothic novels. The monk is superior to, in all respects, to the exotic outburst of Mrs. Radcliffe's exotic imagination. So unsurprisingly, he likes the lurid, sexual, violent horror scenes of Lewis rather than Mrs. Radcliffe, whom he also admired. But it's that darker, more lurid side of the Gothic that he sees as most significant. And the Marquis de Sade is interesting. He's one of the first critics to explore the Gothic in political terms. Until the 1980s, academic inquiry into the Gothic, there wasn't very much. And what there was, tend to dismiss it. But since the 1980s, there's been this new willingness to look at the Gothic according to the tenets of various critical schools, such as a new form of historical inquiry in terms of psychoanalysis and in terms of feminism. Critics of feminist critics have been very interested in the way in which the Gothic novel has portrayed the sufferings of women. But the way in which contemporary critics look at the Gothic novel in political terms is not new. The argument is this: these are not just escapist fictions. They are revealing about the intellectual and historical world of the period in which they were written. And witness to this is Sade himself. He says this: "Then there are the new novels, nearly whose whole merit lies in magic and phantasmagoria, with the monk at their head, which are not entirely without merit. They are the fruit of the revolution of which all Europe has felt shock." So here is the first political reading of the Gothic novel: that the French Revolution of 1789, that the Terror of 1793, that are echoed in the scenes of destruction and torment and violence and revolution of the Gothic novel. Okay, I want to spend the last 10 or 15 minutes of this talk talking about Surrealism, which was an intellectual modernist form of the 1920s and 1930s. So let's go back to Christopher Baldick. He says this: "Surrealism, an anti-rational movement, which from the beginning associates itself with the Gothic and with the Romantic. An anti-rational movement in art and literature in the 1920s and 30s, launched by André Breton in his Manifesto of Surrealism, 1924. Surrealism seeks to break down the boundaries between rationality and irrationality, exploring the resources and revolutionary energies of dreams, hallucination, and sexual desire, exactly to the same territory of the early Gothic novel, especially that of Matthew Gregory Lewis. And as I say, the surrealists, like Sade, were very interested in early Gothic and in Matthew Lewis in particular. The adjectives surreal and surrealistic are often used in a loose sense to refer to any bizarre imaginary effect, but they originally had a very specific meaning. This movement in art, which was based primarily in Paris, but also with significant offshoots in London and New York. Surrealism is an art of dreams, of the irrational, of the superreal, as they called it, a state supposedly beyond normal consciousness. And its key influences are Freudianism, Marxism, Romanticism, and the Gothic. So it's a late form of Romantic thought, I would argue. So the most famous surrealist artist of all is the infamous Spanish artist Salvador Dalí, 1904 to 1989. René Magritte, Belgian surrealist, famous for his portraits of men in bowler hats and eyes. So here is André Breton the Pope of Surrealism, the man who is at the heart of the Surrealist movement. He collaborates with Dali, with the filmmaker Buñuel, and a host of other people. So Surrealism is an alliance of art with dark desire and malevolence and the attraction to dark forces. And it's very interested in, like Gothic, extreme imagery, especially sexual imagery. And it plays with the same concepts of the doll that we were hearing about in Alison's talk earlier this morning. And the severed head, as per Alison's talk this morning. So here's Bellomer's famous surrealist photo sequence, The Doll, 1935. Okay, the most notorious and famous example of surrealist art of the 1920s is not a painting or a photograph, but a film. It's Dali and Brunel's The Andalusian Dog of 1929. I'm going to show you the opening sequence of that now. Human the Grotesque. So there's a preoccupation with abnormal mental states, with extremity, with murder, with mutilation, which are all the heritage to Surrealism, of Romanticism, and before that, the Gothic. So in the 1930s, English critics started to take and pay more attention of Surrealism. So Herbert Reed, the famous sculptor and theorist and artist, says in the most notable British book on Surrealism in 1936, Monk Lewis, Maturin, and Mrs. Radcliffe should, relatively to Scott, Dickens and Hardy, occupy a much higher rank. So a willingness to reread Surrealism. So what are we to make of this art form? What are we to make of art forms such as Gothic, such as the darker forms of Romanticism, such as Surrealism, which go out of their way to shock and disturb us? Now, what's going on in a scene such as the eye gouging? By the way, the eye that's being gouged was that of a dead cow rather than a live woman. And of course, it's carefully cut, so you think oh, it's a woman's eye being slashed when it's no such thing. So is this just what the French call Aperture Media? You know, is this mere shock value? Or do these forms of extreme art, do they actually have things of value to say? The Surrealists were quite clear that they did, and one of the ways in which they achieved this was by aligning their work with Romanticism as the most prestigious European cultural form after the Reformation, after the Renaissance, and with extreme left politics, with Marxism. But that need not concern us here. So what is Surrealism? Surrealism, say David Gascoigne, the famous poet of Surrealism, a man who lived into a great old age. I met him in his 90s, a remarkable man. And he says this in 1936, Surrealism is the lineal heir of Romanticism. The great task of our century, like theirs, is destroying worn-out customs and institutions and constitutions. So Breton argued that in 1936, in that kind of febrile European ferment, which gave rise to Hitler and Mussolini and various Marxist and fascist tendencies, that the Gothic and Romanticism was the new inspiration to his political art. At the time I'm writing, there is no doubt that a new French Revolution has begun. Surrealism is its art, belonging to its period in the same manner, excuse the missing word, in which, whether we like it or not, the style of the Gothic novel may be seen as symbolic of the social troubles in which Europe was enveloped at the end of the 19th century. So the argument is that the late 18th century, the age of the Gothic, is equally a moment of revolution and turmoil and chaos. So he's looking back and arguing that the roots of the Gothic lie in schism, in revolution, and in the art which pays attention to the darker side of human experience. So, in conclusion, in Gothic, Surrealism found an art of revolution which mirrored its own aspiration to Marxist revolution. And finally, in Gothic's dreaming, horror and morbidity, Surrealism found a precursor to its own audacious and shocking artistic methods. Thank you.
I'd like to thank John for his tour de force through the Gothic and the themes and movements that stretch right back into early medieval times. Even on our own doorstep, in fact, you will walk past the very church that John mentioned on your way to London.